Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed.
Hi, it's Norm Leahy. You're on the ballot with you once again for this episode. We're going to be talking about something that's called the administrative state. Now, before you tune away in boredom, there is a real reason to talk about this. It's very important. Some of you in the audience may know it as the deep state, if you choose. But joining me to discuss this is somebody who knows a lot about the state, regardless of what title you want to put on it. Amy Handlin, who's worn many hats. Amy, you're a policy writer at Ballotpedia right now, and you've been a professor for many years, an author, published author, and you've been in state government and local government, I should say. So we're honored to have you on the show to help us walk through this complex but essential topic. So welcome to the show. Glad to have you.
Thank you, Norman. I'm honored to be with you and excited to talk about it.
And there is a lot to talk about, but let's try to keep it a little bit focused because, first of all, the term. Where does this term administrative state come from? What's its evolution in 30 seconds or less?
Well, ironically, the whole notion of creating a state apparatus of professionals who would presumably be well trained and given specific job descriptions in order to run the services that are important to citizens originated as a reaction in the early 20th century to tremendous issues of corruption and incompetence and mismanagement in the public services at that time, where for the most part, who you knew and who you were related to was the sole criterion for determining whether or not you got a public job and whether or not you stayed in that job. And that was the point in history when we had what were called not only no-show jobs, but what were then called low-show jobs, where people would simply accept jobs. They would be paid huge amounts of money for that period of time. And then they would go off on jaunts around the country or around the world because no one was watching and no one cared if the person was the mayor's brother or the biggest donor to the governor or whatever the case might have been. So gradually, and then since really the New Deal, less and less gradually, pretty quickly, we developed as a country sets of rules and regulations that would be administered impersonally and impartially by people specially trained to perform those functions. And that has come to be known as the administrative state. There are a lot of them, and there's no question that they are a part of all of our lives as citizens, and they extend from Washington all the way to our local city halls. So no one escapes them. Everyone is aware of them, and that's part of the reason why there tends to be some frustration, because it seems like every which way we turn, every time we try to make a change in our lives or in how we run our businesses, we run smack into a government rule or regulation.
Right. You need a permit, or you need documentation, or you need to pay a fee, or what have you. I think one of the most common things that people might relate to when you use this topic is something like, I don't know, the DMV. Uh, it's something that people love to hate, but it is essential. They hand out things that we must have to, except for my libertarian friends who don't think they're necessary, but they do hand out driver's licenses that you need to drive on the roads and other forms of identification. They handle licensing of automobiles and everything. So, but more specifically, when we talk about how it's developed at the federal level, for example, and you mentioned that its growth accelerated after the Second World War. What are we talking about? What changed besides the post-war world really changing and everything else? What changed to really juice the growth of an administrative state?
Well, there are a couple of elements. Part of it was the result of deliberate policies, particularly the New Deal policies, originated, of course, by Herbert Hoover slash Franklin Roosevelt, and later extended in the 60s with a huge number of new policies under the Johnson administration and so forth, which needed to be funded and administered. Somebody had to watch that money and hire people to execute on those policies. But the other side of it is that it's citizens themselves who have demanded far, far more by way of public services than anyone would have dreamed of 100 years ago. 100 years ago, most Americans were perfectly satisfied with access, if they even had access, to decent roads and railroads and to some kind of a county court system, and a basic postal service. In some parts of the country, I believe right into the 20th century, it was the Pony Express, whatever it was. But they couldn't have imagined of today's world, today's country, where the government is routinely looked to control commerce, to control the environment, to control the kinds of buildings, the structures that we live in, to control the laws, all of the laws that now extend very, very deeply into our behaviors. And so, we demanded those things over many, many decades, and we got them, and comes back to that saying, "Be careful what you wish for." We have to pay for them, and we have to ensure that they are administered by people who have some interest other than lining their own pockets or trying to marry into the family of some powerful politician.
So it's sort of built up like a coral reef from very innocuous beginning. It just gets bigger and bigger and more exotic as time goes by. So obviously, as something like this expands, there's pushback and there's criticism. And we see a lot of that contemporary criticism today. And I mean, as much as people like to rail against the bureaucracy, oh, those people, they don't know what they're doing. They're people. They're just like us. They're our neighbors. They're our friends. They go to the same grocery stores, and they're not. They didn't just come out from under a lettuce leaf somewhere or drop from the sky. They have the same frustrations with bureaucracy and red tape too, right?
Of course they do. I have many of those myself, and there's no question, just as is in any other group of professionals, you have some who are stupid or uncaring or incompetent, but at their best, those derided bureaucrats are public stewards, and most of them do know what they're doing and do try to help people. It's just a matter of our being able to use the mechanisms that are available to us to make them aware of why certain rules or regulations are not working
Mhm.
for us or for others. And just to go a little bit further into that, when people talk about wanting freedom from regulations, there's a difference between freedom from and freedom to. I also would love to be free of, certain kinds of very annoying rules. But what we have to ask ourselves is, what do we want the freedom to do? Do we want the freedom to ourselves determine whether a bridge might collapse or whether it's safe to land a plane or whether we can trust in the goodwill of our bankers without any kind of regulations to not abscond with our money? Where do we go with that? And the derogatory term that I think you mentioned earlier is the deep state. Well, the opposite of a deep state is a shallow state. And if we want a shallow state, then we better be clear on exactly what we would want to eliminate in order to have a very shallow pool of government rules and regs. For instance, do we want to eliminate the standards that determine water is safe to drink? Do we want to eliminate the requirements on food producers that ensure that our food is safe to eat, or on drug producers that determine that our drugs are safe and effective? Remember that in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century, we had what were called snake oil salesmen because there were no controls on drug products or what people could claim to be selling to cure various diseases. Um, do we want to determine ourselves whether the brakes on a car are or are not likely to fail? So it's easy to say, "Oh, we should eliminate the deep state." But think for a few minutes about what that would mean in our lives, and you realize that it's not so simple.
But there have been efforts over various administrations and decades, situations, to rationalize regulation or to right size federal agencies. How successful have those been over time?
Some of them have been quite successful, and they have been very, very important because again, like any other body of professionals, anywhere doing anything, you're going to have, bad apples, and you're going to have structures, and services that are no longer necessary or are hopelessly inefficient to be run by the government or by a certain level of government. So, without taking a position one way or another, an example of how that has happened very recently is, the Department of Education, the Federal Department of Education is in the process of being, wound down, if not entirely eliminated, because it was determined, for better, for worse, and again, I'm not saying whether it's good or bad, but it has been determined that the services provided by that department of the federal government were no longer, worth what taxpayers were paying for them, or could be provided those services could be provided more effectively and more efficiently by the states. Now, there's also any number of examples around the country on state and local levels to take care of certain rules, regulations, government entities that had outlived their uselessness. And I'll give you one example of that. In New Jersey has the highest property taxes in the country, and about two-thirds of those property taxes go to support schools, public schools. So it's an enormously expensive system. And it was discovered a couple of decades ago that part of the contributors to the costs, not a huge part, but not an insignificant part either, was what were called non-operating school systems, which were school systems that had no schools and educated no students. They were bodies which had paid staff doing nothing but writing checks and holding meetings and keeping minutes of those meetings, which had to do with the transportation of a handful of students, sometimes as few as 5, to another school district, which would actually educate them. So the non-operating school districts were finally eliminated in, I believe, 2009 at the state level through a piece of legislation against which 27 legislators voted. Now, I don't even wanna speculate as to why they could have voted no. Frankly, it could have been as simple as, their cousins were employed in those, non-operating
Ah.
districts. But it does happen, is my point.
So that sounds like we've come full circle back to the Gilded Age problems that
That's
that
right.
that
Rules of danger.
gave rise to this. But
Right.
we're running up against the clock, Amy, and I want to ask you a couple quick things. One, because we will be talking again because this is a huge issue. But where can we follow your writing?
Well, I wrote a book on exactly this, matter. It's called Government Grief. And, it was published by the reference publisher Prager. It's available, out of, on Amazon if it's out of print at this point. They can always reprint, new ones in today's publishing world. And I also that goes into the background of all of this. I also wrote a book called Be Your Own Lobbyist, published by the same house. And Be Your Own Lobbyist delves very, very deeply into the various strategies and tactics that ordinary people can use to break through what seems like an impenetrable morass of rules and regulations. So if people would like that support, that guidance, Be Your Own Lobbyist is definitely still out there, and Government Grief, I'm sure, is obtainable as well.
And of course, we can read you in the Checks and Balances newsletter
Sure.
from Ballotpedia. And I urge people to check that out at ballotpedia.org. Amy, we're going to be talking a lot more. But I thank you for giving us the overview we needed so we can have those other talks.
Terrific. Looking forward to it, Norm.
Thanks for joining us. Amy Handlin, one of Ballotpedia's top flight policy writers. And I've been Norm Leahy, still am Norm Leahy, here on The Ballot. We'll be back soon next week with a new episode. Until then, we'll see you in the pages of Ballotpedia. Take care.